All right, it says we are live, so we'll start our Finance Committee meeting here. Sandy is going to be a little late, but is planning on being here shortly. So the two things on our agenda: discuss community education finances and discuss the expenditures per truth and taxation levy. We'll start with the first one, community ed finances. So
I guess I printed all these out as one packet, so I'll skip the first couple of pages to get to the community ed stuff.
nice.
All right, so if we'll start with a page that looks like this, it has the community service fund at the top. So this is to give you a snapshot of looking at, now that we're partway through the year. I haven't formally obviously revised the budget because that process is done and taken at the board level. But so this is for just our discussion for today, where I've looked at and kind of revised for changes that have come along the way, such as restructuring some contracts, making an assumption that we're going to keep moving forward with our summer rec and other general community service projects being outside of the district. So just kind of looking at those items and revising the budget for that so that we can kind of look to see where we're sitting with the deficit that we know is in the community service fund. So this is just kind of, so doing that, there's still a deficit in the year when you're just looking at the revenue and expenditures. So not only do we have to figure out, it's going to be a two-step process. One process is, what do we want to do to pay back the deficit that has already incurred over the beginning of time in this community service fund? The second process is looking at your current revenue and expenditure structure to figure out on an annual basis this fund, it stands alone and either breaks even or makes a little bit of money versus deficit spending each year. So this chart down here is just taking the projected fund balance, being that we're halfway through the year, there's probably not a lot that's going to happen. So it's taking that balance. So I just rounded up to 500,000, and just to show you guys what the general fund, there's three different options there. One, taking it out to 15 years, the other 10 years, and then 5 years, what it will take for the general fund to start paying back this deficit. Now, tuition is also going to play a part in this. So we'll look at tuition and hopefully to the point where not all this $500,000 will have to be paid back by the general fund, but this is just looking at it for analytical purposes right now to kind of see what it would look like if everything was a break-even standpoint from now on, what it would look like to pay the deficit that we have back. So that just kind of gives you an idea of what would come out of the general fund and hit community service fund to help bring this back to a positive number. The next document that says Little Warriors, this is a tuition revenue analysis that Jim and I did. And basically it breaks it up where we're currently at by rate and what was proposed back in 19 for fiscal year 20 for tuition rates. And as you can, so then we just ran down, and now the numbers that we have here for child counts are based upon this year's number. So obviously that's going to fluctuate a little bit here and there each year.
And that's the 18, 6, 5,
Yep.
11, 5, and 4. That's number of kids in the program today.
Based upon those fee structures. And then so we multiplied those out, and we also did that for the 3-year-old program based upon the sliding scale of 70, 45, and 25. There also is a Pathways grant that we've been granted every year for $37,500, and basically that is taking some of your free and reduced kids that qualify and giving them a scholarship. So it's not necessarily additional revenue, but yet it's supplementing the tuition that we wouldn't have above because the parents are paying a tuition, but we're getting that revenue in to help offset that tuition. So then you add those numbers up to get the total tuition-based revenue. Then I took the other revenues budgeted, so you get levy dollars, and you get some school readiness levy dollars, community ed levy dollars. There's gonna be, donations and other participation fees that might come in. So then you get a total cost of revenue of $194,701. And then I just took my revised budget based upon the first document that we looked at and broke it up for the payroll costs, so you could see that separately, and then the non-payroll costs to get to the total cost of the programs. And then just to show you the change between the calculated or analyzed revenue and where the budget is showing costs are gonna be. Then I also did the same exact process for the amount that was proposed back in 19. So the base was gonna be 120 for 4-year-olds and 80 for 3-year-olds, and then obviously we still have this sliding scale. Use the same number of students in those categories and calculated it all out, and did the same exact process and still comparing it to budgeted expenditures for fiscal year 22 here. And then show you the change, showing that it's definitely a necessity to do transfers and look at tuition revenue. We definitely need to go with a recommendation to the board to definitely change tuition revenue. I didn't get a chance to see what surrounding districts were at, but I think when this process, I remember correctly when we did this process back then, these rates were still under where we were surrounding, and that was already a few years ago, so I'm guessing we're even more behind the 8 ball with that too, but we can also do that analysis to make sure that we're not, with a preschool next door charging 3 times what they're choosing,
Right.
or paying, or charging, excuse me. So, I mean, we'll still do that analysis as well, but at some point, these programs have to stand alone. So we do have to look at revenue, because there's only so many reductions you can make. I mean, we could take out transportation, but we are charging a fee if families need the transportation. And I understand as a parent too, that is a complete benefit to offer transportation. So, I mean, but there's other options we can look at on the expenditure side as well, if we need to. But I think we can do it with tuition for now, and keep an eye on it. We just can't go 10 years before we analyze it again,
Right.
because we're gonna be behind the 8 ball. I mean, cost of living is at least 2% a year.
Yeah. And what do you think on the expenditure side you can see changing, or, I know you don't wanna go there yet, but you said there are things that we can do on that side.
Yeah, so one thing I said is transportation. So I think we'd have to make sure that our fee that we're charging is still covering the cost to provide that transportation, because it's a benefit, but it's not a requirement.
Well, the
Right.
thing is they either pay it through transportation as a fee, or it's costing them to haul their kid around, so either way,
Yep,
Right, exactly.
they have to pay it.
When you look at time and effort as well as gas,
yes.
Exactly.
they're making out like bandits here.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm not saying, I mean, it is a place for a reduction, don't get me wrong, I'm not sure that it's maybe the best. Just because you might lose tuition, just because a family can't get the student there. And
Right.
it's also hard once that service has been provided to take it away for families,
Yeah.
especially, if they had a 3-year-old and all of a sudden they're 4 and now they have to figure out
Yeah.
transportation.
Right.
But maybe that's where like this pathways or whatever can help, maybe help support that a little bit for the people that can't get the free, who absolutely can't afford to send their child there. Maybe there's a little bit that they can get a little reduction in the transportation, but it's not coming out of the general fund or anything, it's coming from this.
Yeah,
pathway.
so that's how we do it. So essentially, if they qualify for pathways, that's a piece of it in there, not just tuition, but that's a piece of it in there. But then we would still have a fee, just like we have for the
Right.
full, where they would, if they're using transportation, that we would provide that. So I think,
And that would still have to be made up somewhere else, because the pathways is 37.5, whether we have 1 kid using it or 100 kids using it.
Okay, so, and that doesn't go up, that
No.
stays the same?
No,
it stays the same, and actually you
Okay.
are only guaranteed the 37.5 if you have enough kids that qualify. So you're not guaranteed the whole 37.5. Now, we haven't, well, because COVID, we did have it, last year we did have an issue with it because of COVID. because you have to provide enough you have to break the scholarships, and it's based upon instructional hours and having enough students. So yes, we don't have a problem using the 37.5, but it's not gonna increase, and it could decrease if you don't have enough qualifying factors to use the money up.
Question for you, under other revenues, from the current, which is at 131,000, to the other is 194, how does that get bumped up so much or taken down? This is older and this is newer, right?
So
So it's been
this is
decreased?
proposed, well, this is where we're currently at, and this is where we're proposed. So the other revenue is basically taken into consideration, what would have been budgeted for tuition up here, and then subtracting from the total budget. Does that make sense? So the reason the total revenue is more is because our tuition revenue is more.
Okay, yep, okay. All right,
So,
so that's Little Warriors and that's
So-
part of community ed.
well, and pretty much that is the reason for the deficit spending in community service. So like, you can see like back to this community service, you can see like under the restricted, that's running at a positive. But that's can only be used for, so what is coming in there is there's things like non-public aid for textbook, health services and guidance that we get in, and then we have to provide those services to the non-public schools within your district. There's preschool screening and there's stuff like that, so it's very restricted in what you can use. So that is not included in my analysis. I only looked at ECFE, community education, school readiness, because Little Warriors is sprinkled in all of those three categories, if that makes sense.
Really, it's
Yep.
even into the community ed part, huh?
Yep,
And
Because
how-
you can-
how so with that?
because those levy dollars that come in are also, that preschool can be part of those levy dollars as well. So we have all of our staff and all of our costs allocated between all three of those categories.
What proportion of the community ed is for ECFE and school readiness, as far as salaries even?
I could get that breakdown for you off the top of my head. I don't know what the breakdown is.
It'd be interesting to see of the community ed salaries, what is for that, and then what's for the other part of community ed, to see if that part of community ed is in the red too.
So because when I revised the budget, for instance, like the summer rec costs, I took those out, knowing that, or making the assumption that come this spring, we're gonna be operating differently for our general community, what I call the general community ed stuff. So that stuff is already taken out, but you do have some administrative costs that are gonna be in this community ed budget, besides part of it that's Little Warriors. Yep, so there is gonna be a small portion in that community ed budget that's not Little Warriors, but the rest of it I've kind of piecemealed out already, given the direction that we're moving, if that makes sense.
So are you saying the ECFC, some of the Little Warriors, some of this money is coming in under the general fund for those specific things and then being transferred to the community ed to cover these?
No, right now, as of right now, the general fund is not transferring money over to the community service fund.
Well, you talked about the extras being put into the community ed following these other programs. Where does that money come from?
What I mean is based upon time studies of your director and the secretary, the time that they spend on community ed. So some of their salary and expenses are allocated over here in the general fund for general fund activities, and some of it's allocated over in community ed, but it's based upon their job duties and responsibilities and time studies. So it's not that I'm taking money or expenses and putting them over from here to the general fund, like they're really coded based upon what their job duties are. So their position is just double duty, if you want to look at it that way.
Is this their actual time or their contracted original thought time?
In the past, it used to be contract, kind of based upon how contracts were done. definitely had them do work studies, or time studies.
Time studies.
Thank you. Time study, so it's based upon looking at a couple week time period and actually analyzing exactly how their time is spent.
Yeah, because I thought at one point, didn't you say, that Derek was spending like 5 or 10% of his time in community ed? I thought you had mentioned
Yeah.
that. So in that case, you know, with his salary versus the amount of time he's spending in there, is that cost effective? That we need to look at that too.
I did, and that's why we did the time studies. So that position has always been whole, and it's always been a full FTE, and there's always the work there. But analyzing which fund it should be in, we were not right on there because it was based upon straight contract language versus a time study. So now when you really look at it, it's not that not that work has been removed or there wasn't enough work there. It should have been only one contract, and then a time study should have been done a long time ago.
Because I think in 18, the 17-18 school year, I think that's when it went from an hourly pay
Mm-hmm.
to 2 different contracts. And we were talking about this. We don't remember any discussion on why it was 60% activities, 20 or 40% community ed. We don't understand how that decision was made. It was just kind of arbitrary, I think.
But so that in the revised expenditures, that's already taken that into consideration and actually putting them in the right buckets based upon their time study.
What is the actual now split between the community ed? It was looked at as 40% before, after the time studies, what does it look like?
So the one position is they're both about, the one was 7% and the one was 10. So compared to the 0.4 that it was thought of previously.
I would assume the secretary was 10%.
And then who's the 7?
The director position. So those are what I would call more of the administrative costs to make sure the program is running and the day-to-day work that needs to get done outside the program. So you're still gonna have some of those costs, which would be above and beyond the little warriors that we were looking at when we were analyzing the tuition and stuff like that. But alone that's gonna help on a year-to-year basis to make sure that we're continually doing time studies to make sure that the job duties line up with what buckets they're being put in. So I know that's kind of a lot. Do you guys have questions?
Because when you think about it, it was taking money out of community service that shouldn't have been taken out of there, but it was also relieving the activities fund budget of money that should have been spent out of there.
So is the community service different than the community ed? Or
So-
that's what,
So
are they two in the same?
So the community service fund.
Yep.
Is separate from the general fund, so it's its own fund. And under that fund, all of these are an umbrella underneath that
Got
fund.
I think a lot of times we refer to the community service as community ed.
Yes,
Until I got into this
Which-
role, I did that all the time. I didn't even know there was a difference.
yes. So there's a lot of things that can go under the community service fund. For instance, some schools have fitness centers, some schools have licensed daycare centers. That stuff all still goes under that community service fund umbrella. And then there's buckets underneath that umbrella that they fit under.
So activities director or activities are under that umbrella also?
Oh, no, sorry, did I say that?
I don't know if you,
But no, activities are not under the community service fund. That is the general fund.
Yeah, okay,
It's like, shoot.
okay, all right.
So I mean, it's kind of a lot to process, and I mean, this is just kind of a proposal. But once we start really looking at tuition and, a recommendation taken to the board and that getting approved, then I think it's good to set up a transfer, plan essentially. And then that way, I would for sure budget that transfer that way every year based upon this approved plan. But let's say, in the general fund, we had some budget savings somewhere. If we wanted to, depending on which option we want, if we decided that it'd be a good idea to use that budget savings over in the general fund and do a little bit extra in 1 year, then it would just go to the board for approval and say, what about doing another 10,000 to the community service fund to pay that deficit back? So it's not like we're stuck in stone with it, but at least it's a plan going forward that we do at least the minimum of this to work at paying this back.
The state hasn't said anything to us about it yet. We want to have a plan in place before they do. You know,
Yeah, because it doesn't look pretty.
no, it doesn't. And it's hard to explain. I remember last year somebody was asking me, and again, I knew half of what I know now, and it's still not very much. But I'm trying to explain it, and yeah, it's bad.
And the nice thing is we have a very robust preschool program that everyone loves. We're lucky we have 2 great licensed teachers, and then there's pairs that have to support that because there's also a ratio with little kids that you have to uphold as well. So hopefully someday, it's been brought up every time that, you know, the state, if they want to keep pushing that student or by the time they get 5 to get into kindergarten, they need to be at this level already, then hopefully they'll start funding preschool. That's the problem. There's just not the funding there.
As I understand it, the political powers that be right now are pushing vastly hard for preschool,
Mhm.
but their definition of preschool is kindergarten. Most states don't have it. And that's what
Well,
their
on the
definition.
federal
Sure.
level, you
The
mean?
federal level's looking
Sure.
at a kindergarten program, and I mean, we're going a
We
lot
need our
further
state to look
down.
at the preschool program.
Yeah, right,
Yes.
so I mean, we don't get our hopes up about the federal ever changing. You know, because if there's states that haven't even got a kindergarten program, that's gonna be the number one emphasis, as I understand.
And one of the frustrations I have is that there are, I don't know how many schools, but there's a lot of school districts that the state is paying for their preschool. And that goes back, I don't know, 10 years maybe?
Well, so there's grant.
It's the voluntary pre-K.
Yeah, they're kind of like grants, but basically, so the voluntary pre-K and then there's a school readiness plus. So we apply for it every year, but it's, a lot rides on your free and reduced percentages. And obviously, there's a lot of districts that have much higher free and reduced. So we don't usually make the cut. We still apply for it because, they give out what they call seats. So you say, we need 20 seats, which means 20 kids. Let's say they only end up being able to account for 12 of them. So there sometimes there's unfunded seats where if you did apply, at least at the end of the year, you might be able to get if there's some unfunded revenue. So we make sure we do our due diligence to apply for it in case, but that's only in the hopes that some of the money did get used up. But yeah, so for instance, the volunteer pre-K, you get like 0.6 of the general education revenue to help fund the preschool program. So they're getting a little state aid in to help, where only if you're a voluntary pre-K school do you get that. And the rest of us are very much reliant on tuition, little levy dollars, but the levy dollars are a little bit. And so the rest is based on your tuition revenue.
So basically, you take the difference between 44% and of a salary and 7% and 44% of a secretary's salary versus 10%. Those differences over the last 5 years, since 2018, would be a substantial lump sum of overcharging to community ed
Yes,
that went into general fund.
will that help the general
Yeah,
fund? Yeah.
Right, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yep,
And I would like to know what that number is. And I could see as a plan, take that number directly from general fund to reimburse now. Plan A, we're looking $33,000 a year for 15 years. And in this year alone, we're looking at twice that in a deficit of 58,000 this year.
yep.
And so, I mean, that's like a credit card.
So, but
Paying
what,
minimum, you'll never see the end of it.
no, but what I'm saying is, I can't do anything about the deficit spend this year. But what we can do is make sure next year when we set tuition that we don't deficit spend. So what I am saying is we need to make sure that this stays where it's at and keeps decreasing by the amount that we transfer from the general fund. What I'm saying is starting next year, these programs have to stand alone by themselves. But the general fund is gonna have to help pay back the money, because we're not gonna be able to do it any other way. But yes, I mean, if you look at the deficit spend this year, 33 doesn't even cover that. But what I'm saying is that's not gonna continue to happen. We need to look at tuition so that we're covering our expenditures.
That's just barely half of the deficit for this year.
Yes, but what I'm saying is in 23, we don't have that deficit. So that otherwise, yes, you're not gaining anything. I mean,
No,
you're working at it a little bit, but you're
well,
gonna
that's paying
continue
less
to
than,
do this for the
that's
rest of the
paying
time.
less than half of what the minimum credit card is.
Yep,
And this isn't figuring interest on this money either.
right.
This is just the dollars.
But what you gotta realize too is that we're also getting to the point where we're working on the general fund too, because we didn't have this option a couple years ago where we were sitting, that we're being very diligent to make sure that we have those options, but in the general fund, there's also a lot of expenditures, also big expenditures that are coming as well. So why I gave you the 3 options is because you kind of have to outweigh what the general fund looks like as well. I mean, you can't fix one problem and create another either. So that's why and I'm not saying that we should necessarily go out for 15 years, but we got to make sure that our general fund can sustain it as well. So I mean, to take what has happened since 2018 and say we're going to transfer all that in 1 year, I'm not sure financially that will make sense for the general fund as well. So we kind of got to make sure that we're balancing both at the same time.
Well, either way, the money's gone.
Yeah, that's what I was just gonna say.
Whether it's gone out of the general fund or it's gone out of the community ed fund, it's gone.
That is very true, but you also have to be
And-
careful because the general fund, you have to make sure that you're making your fund balance policy as well. And you got to make sure that you have enough sitting in the general fund because that's where the education of our students' expenses are sitting. So we have to make sure that we can maintain it and keep it going forward.
So there is a policy on the general fund, but there's not one on the deficit on the community ed
No.
fund.
Nope,
I think we need a policy on the deficit
I
on the
was gonna
community
say,
ed fund too.
because we have to stop the bleeding
'Cause
somehow.
it's not a place to store debt.
no, I don't disagree with you at all.
Yeah.
I'm just saying you got to make sure you're looking at all aspects of the school, all of it together. And making sure that you're not fixing one and that created a problem over here as well. So, because the general fund is highly regulated when we're talking MTE and stuff like that, where why it's not in the community service fund, I'm not sure. I mean, even like Jim and I were talking about, like with the food service fund, we actually have to spend down dollars because you can't have too much in the food service fund. So,
And this is something I think a lot of people don't understand, and it doesn't even make sense to most people that, so we have to spend, was it $46,000? $46,000, we have to spend that. But we can only spend it on nutrition program things and things that directly impact the kitchen. But we can't take that $46,000 and pay it towards the community ed fund or community service fund. I think most people don't understand some of those constraints that we're put under.
Yep.
Because we would never operate our house like that. and even a small business wouldn't operate that way because they don't have those constraints. So
If they would have had that rule for everything else, we wouldn't have the building problems we've got
no,
today.
you're right. Yeah.
You know, and it used to be years ago, you had capital expenditure fund that was, you couldn't monkey with to make sure you maintained your building. But that's gotten skipped someplace along the line, and now we have buildings falling down because nobody's maintaining.
There's just, yep, there's not enough revenue coming in for these old schools to keep maintaining where it needs to be maintained.
When I'm going to be talking about this a lot in the future here, but one of the things the state is looking at doing is fixing the special ed cross subsidies. And I just talked about this quite a bit today. I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but we're paying $950 per student for a total of about $500,000 to subsidize what the government is supposed to be paying us for special ed. To put that $950 into perspective, is we passed a referendum a few years back for $624 per student to help make what we're doing better. And when you think about that, it's all going to offset this money that we're required to spend there. I definitely don't want to make it sound like I'm anti-special ed.
No, I was just gonna ask you how many students do we have that are special ed?
I'm not sure. I'm
Is it
not
more
sure.
than 50?
Oh, yeah,
I'm sure,
I guarantee you that our child count is,
70, 80, I don't know. Maybe more than that.
I can look it up.
But we've been battling that since the 80s.
Yeah.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yep, it's not.
Unfunded mandates.
Yep.
And I mean, we can spend a lot of time on it, but we aren't gonna get anything done.
No, but I guess the reason I'm gonna start bringing it up more and more is that they're talking about it a lot more federally and at the state level, and that's something that has a direct impact on all of us.
I mean, you
It can
can
really help.
special education districts down in the metro where a special ed student is a plus to your general fund. Because they have a specific district set up to fund that, or at least they used to years ago.
Yeah, they still do those. They
And
call it
so
intermediate school.
those kind of things don't go away when to their advantage.
Yeah,
And so,
and there's a lot of metro things that
right.
don't
We know
help
along
us at all.
these, going back to this, the time studies for the community ed, if we need to stop the bleeding because this is significant. This isn't just a little bit, this is huge. While we're looking at that, we've also had Jackie Edwards come in about this whole wellness thing with the YMCA. At some point, with this time study, whatever, would that be able to cover and take over community ed and stop the bleeding there? And then maybe we can get this to the Little Warriors. We increase the tuition and the transportation costs, we can get that to run itself. And this part will go away. What percentage?
Well, you gotta remember that we already kind of are there. Like, I don't see this these percentages getting any smaller, because the biggest, when you look at the whole community service fund and all the stuff in the umbrella, the biggest part is your preschool program. Well, that's internal. That needs to stay internal, and we still have to have somebody to help manage that and supervise and do the HR work and all that stuff. So you're always gonna have some non-program cost.
Because I was thinking if you could eliminate a couple positions and maybe have the teacher be the director for this and whatever, somewhere you have to be able to cut the fat somewhere, otherwise we just have to.
But if you think about how busy the teachers are, that's gonna be a lot to manage some of the things that a secretary can do for them. And I mean, you're always gonna have a little bit of it. But I mean, coming from 0.4 down to 7 and 10%, that's a significant reduction in the community service fund already. I mean, we could probably maybe get it a little bit lower with secretary time and stuff like that, but you're always gonna have a little bit of administrative time that needs to happen.
Interesting to see what that number would be annually, going from the 44% down to 7% or the 10%. And see what that number is over the last 5 years total.
Yep, I can calculate that for you.
Like what it would have been.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
You know, because that's a direct undercharge to the general fund over the last 5 years.
Yep.
You know, that money's still laying there, you know.
Yeah, it's probably. what,
Yeah, because it was
40
taken out of the community ed fund and put in the general fund.
About 40,000.
And so 40,000 a year
I'm
on
just ballparking that, yeah.
on 5 years, that's 200,000. You know, that gets us a good start on our deficit. You know, and then,
And we'll be able to start that this year. Well, at the end of the year, we'll be able to code that
The
properly.
payback.
Yep, I just foresee it being a multi-year process versus trying to fix it in 1 year. I just,
well, if we knock
Yeah.
200,000 off, that would still leave a multi-year project of another 300,000.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, we still have to balance up the budget on it yet besides,
yes, and
you know,
but
this,
like I said, that's gonna be revenue based after this, so like I feel like we've done what we can on the expenditure side.
Yeah.
So it's gonna be revenue based, so we are not gonna be able to fix that until fiscal year 23.
and
Cause I
guess
mean,
would
you don't
look at-
normally raise rates in the middle of,
I guess I would
Yeah.
endorse a deal of take that payback to knock down the $500,000 deficit. And option A is not even an option. And at least go to option B or C to
I agree. Yeah, I
To-
agree with that.
get it done. So,
If you can afford it.
Right.
well, the money's gone.
Yeah.
Oh, it's already spent.
it is, but it's
I-
balancing both budgets at the same time.
Has anyone talked to, let's see, what's Ms. Fisher's first name?
It's
Well,
Ringgold.
No,
Who?
Fisher, what's Ms. Fisher?
Cassidy.
Cassie. I just remember the last time when we did talk about raising tuition, they were against that, and I think that's why that didn't pass.
Yeah,
So
I talked to them.
You did?
I talked to
Okay.
Lindsay today.
I just think they need to be involved in that.
They understand that this is, just has to happen.
And it is hard, cause you went from free
Right.
to the last approval of the 80 and what are they doing my paper? 80 and 70. In it, I get it, because looking at it from a program standpoint, I completely get that. You know, you look at your parents and so I completely get that, but in the same sense, we'll keep continuing down this path if we don't.
Do something.
Yeah,
Do
we won't be
something,
able to
yeah.
have it at all.
So unless the state steps in and there's gonna be some other funding sources that come in to help with a preschool program, you know, then you can kind of look at that, because then you can back off that a little bit. But where we are standing right now and what we get in for revenue sources, unfortunately, the biggest piece of the pie is your tuition revenue, and so we have to use that.
Absolutely.
Well, now we're talking about an after-school program and this type of stuff. How is that projecting out with the cost and the benefits on that? You know, those type of things in community ed.
The after-school program's not community ed. The after-school,
There's SR.
yes, that's running through the general fund,
And
and
that
that's,
will cash flow on its own.
that is because of federal dollars. And
But once that's gone, it's done.
yeah, I mean, obviously you'd have to look to see if that program could sustain itself by, but it would be the same thing, it would have to turn into a fee-based program then. Yep, So,
Probably
like,
greater
we-
need for it now after COVID.
correct, and that's
Trying to get
why,
kids caught up.
why they're restricting it to be only after school or summertime, is because they need those kids to be in and getting help longer. I mean, you can only do so much during the school day and continue with the curriculum. So, but yes, that program essentially might only be here for a few years. I mean, the third allocation goes out to September 30th of 24. So we have a few fiscal years to take advantage of these programs to help the kiddos catch up, but after that, it's gonna have to be looked at hard, and it probably is a program that might have to go away.
So at the present time, it is a funded federal program.
Correct.
but it's soon to become a non-funded
It's
federal
a,
program.
it's a one-time,
Yeah,
it's one-time monies that are given and it's
so we could
restricted
start the
for,
program at no cost to us and no cost to parents then?
correct, it can't be fee-based.
Okay.
Yep.
But then it'll have to become fee-based or end.
Correct.
Either have to become fee-based, or if it was something that the community valued, we levy for it. Those would be the two options.
You'd have to, yeah, see if your budget can
And they're
afford
gonna
it.
cover transportation and everything like that.
All that is eligible.
Wow.
Mhm.
That's pretty awesome. Do we know, is this fairly close to what Play Island is charging this year?
That I did not get the time to analyze where the surrounding
Because,
are, and I said that would have to be part of our analysis before
Mhm.
the final decision or recommendation is made.
because if parents look around and they say, especially if you start charging this higher fee and they'll be like, well, I'm gonna go check over here and be like, oh, but they're charging that too. How about over here? Oh, but they're charging that.
Yeah. But I know that so this was proposed back in 19, and I know that analysis was done then, and we made sure that we stayed where we weren't the highest place or the highest preschool around. So I know now, given that it's a couple years later, I don't think that we have to worry with that rate, that we would be too high. But like I said, the analysis still needs to be done.
Right, because it's like, if you can start not backing up and being more in the red or in the black,
Correct.
it's why skimp so much when you can be there if other places are charging the same anyway.
Right, that's what I mean. We definitely need to do it through tuition revenue.
Well,
Yeah.
the other side of that is we, as a school district, we also don't want to be taking business away from businesses. And
Exactly.
if we're charging zero, why would anyone go to Play Island?
Mhm.
And I mean, my job isn't to worry about Play Island necessarily, but
No.
you do have to worry about the community
Right.
and the school districts have different types of resources and you have to be careful that you don't.
Agreed.
So any other questions on that piece of the agenda?
All right.
So there was a couple other documents that we kind of skipped over that were on top, and there was a question in regards to the truth and taxation meeting that we just
That was me.
yeah, that we need to clear up because I'm not sure what you were looking at in particular, except for I
just took your expenses and the 21-22 budget of $9,545,000.
Yep.
Subtract the 2021 actual budget. I come
no,
up.
that's expenditures. You're looking
Oh,
at.
yeah, I'm in expenditures, right.
So that's why I printed both these slides out. So this is revenue for 22.
Okay,
This is expenditures. There's still a deficit of 253. But then if you look at this other document, this is the budget summary that the board approves that ties exactly to those budget numbers. And the biggest piece of that is what the issue that we're trying to fix, which is the community service fund. There is a little bit in the general fund of 76,045. But if you remember correctly, if you remember from my presentation of the adopted budget, the reason that is because we have reserves sitting in long-term facility maintenance and we budgeted $400,000 to do a roof project. So that means so much of the revenue that's coming is just for the current year, but then we have reserves. So when you add the reserves and the revenue together, we have enough to do this roof project.
how much was the roof project?
What's budgeted is 400,000.
400,000.
So if you add back that one-time expenditure that you're using reserves for, we're not deficit spending. That's the confusing thing about school finance is you have to look at not only the current year revenue and expenditures, but you also have to look at your fund balance and how that's playing out. So yes, our expenditures are higher, but that's because we have this reserve set aside to do this project. It's a one-time project. It's not going to continue next year. So it's not like we're creating a year-to-year deficit spend. It's okay to have a deficit spend if you're doing it because you have a one-time project or purchases that you're gonna be made and you have a plan for it.
So our budget minus our 2021 actual is a difference of $528,642. And of that, 400,000 is a roof repair of standing funds. That still leaves you with, your expenditures are going up $128,000.
Yes, but that's always gonna happen because you have cost of living adjustments all the time. You're gonna have contracts, you're gonna have fees for services. I mean, I don't think there's any business that can say that your expenditures aren't gonna go up from year to year.
Right.
So,
But the thing is, at the same time, we hope their revenues don't drop as bad as ours are. Because our revenues, we were 9,891,000, and now this year, they're only going to be 9,292,000.
Right, but you gotta take into consideration 400,000 of those expenditures we're using reserves for.
He's talking the
Was
revenue.
that
Revenue.
Correct,
Our revenue.
correct.
The
But
reserves don't impact the
But
revenue.
the expenditures went up because of that project. So you have to take $400,000 out of your expenditures for that one-time project that we're doing.
Right, we already covered.
And then, and then compare it to your revenue. And that's why I gave you the summary, so that you can look at it a little bit better.
I don't know if I got that one.
Right here.
I got it. Okay.
So if you look at the revenue and expenditures by fund, they tie back to these two slides. Showing, yes, we're working on the community service fund, like that's the biggest piece of it. But the general fund, we would have net income versus net
General fund
deficit because of, right, but only because of that roof project.
76,000.
Right, you would have to add 400,000 back to that because that's a one-time project that we're doing and we're using reserves for it.
So you're saying that we could look at this 8,511,000 number as 12,511,000.
Not 12.
Or I'm sorry,
I was like, whoa.
Wow. I got really greedy.
Well, and I should,
So it's
8,911,000.
so, yes, it's complicated, I get that. So I guess I shouldn't say that you should add 400,000 back because part of that 400,000 is also current year revenue coming in. So we roughly get about 250,000 in each year for LTFM. So really you would only take the difference between your $400,000 project, the current revenue that we're getting in of 250,000. That difference is what we're using in reserves. That is why our expenditures look so much higher than our revenue is because we're using reserves over here. So that's why it's hard, because if you just look at current revenue and expenditures and that's all you look at, it's hard to see the bigger picture of where the
On
district.
my checkbook, the revenues and the expenditures have a major impact on the bottom line.
They do, but you probably also have a savings account, so when your expenditures are going out, you have money over here. Well, that's it's not as simple as that, but like that's what a reserve does for you. So these areas are restrictive in nature and can only be spent in those categories. So sometimes in a given year, you receive 250,000, but you only had $100,000 in expenditures. Well, that money just doesn't disappear. It carries over into the next year. So then you can do a bigger project because you have the carryover plus what you're getting in the next year.
That was my question. So this 400,000 was in another budget somewhere else, because otherwise, why wouldn't you
It's
just put it in
This was
this
money
and
that
make
was
this
set aside in
8.9?
that.
You know what I mean? Because you do have it.
But it's
But already
a carryover
been-
from a
it's
previous
carryover
year.
for
It's not
something
it's not a current year revenue. Yep.
Okay.
So that's why it's confusing.
Right, so is there a reason why we don't do, that's proposed, is there any reason why we don't do a year-to-date one then, so you can see that, or? instead of just looking at the proposed one for that year? Cause you said.
So, no, so when I give you guys a budget, you have the current year revenue and expenditure budget, then we also look at the fund balance. In the fund balance is gonna have the 8,511,000 year revenue column. It's gonna have the 8,587,000 in the expenditure column. But then you're gonna have what you carried over from the previous year of dollars, and then you add your revenue, subtract your expenses, and you get this ending fund balance. That's what you look at to see the healthiness of the district. So yes, it shows we're deficit spending here, but if you actually look at the LTFM line item, that is what we're spending down, but the unassigned, where we need to make sure that we have enough to maintain our fund balance policy and have enough in there for any expenditures that we don't know about or unbudgeted at the time, that's going up.
Okay, so the reports you give us each month, which ones we be looking at it like that?
Nope, those are an annual thing, once the year finalizes, let me show you what.
Yeah, could you print that up?
Yep. Do that.
It's nice to have a visual with these. It's hard enough to understand with the visual.
Right.
I wonder if we could attach these documents to the video. I wonder if that's possible. It'd be nice if somebody was watching the video, they'd be able to
Oh, yeah, that'd be really
actually see what we're talking about. Like I just said, it's hard enough to understand this with.
I know.
Sorry, I have to send this to that computer because I can't print from here, so give me 1 second.
Another thing on the revenues we've got included in that, the debt redemption in the previous year, which is no longer there. So that skews it by another 334,000.
Oh, sure, I see what you're saying.
Yes, we don't have debt service anymore.
Right. So
Yep.
that-
So what is the debt redemption? Is that,
That was the last bond issue payment.
yeah, so, but is that money that we,
That was levied.
It was levy dollars.
Okay, oh,
Revenue and
yeah,
expenditure.
that makes sense. Yep, I got it.
Yeah, that was the, what, 99 edition ran off or whatever.
No, the last one was the parking lot project.
Oh, the parking lot project.
We just did is it a 3-year on that?
Oh, okay.
I think it ended up being over a 4-year period, but I think we only had 3 years of debt service payments, if that makes sense. Like, it was issued like 4 years ago, but our payments were only, actually came out in 3 years.
Yeah, and I seem to remember that there was another bond that dropped off.
Yeah, there was a.
Yeah, that was
last
begun
bond
before
issue.
that.
And maybe that was the 99?
That process.
Just right before the parking lot.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so it didn't impact,
yeah, it's just kept.
Right.
I didn't want to say it didn't impact the
Right.
taxpayer, but
Yeah. The
Wasn't
parking
an
lot
It's a difference.
extended it another 3 years.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, we still took their money.
Yeah. Right.
I don't mean to sound flip about that, but it's,
No, but I took off that 332,900 from the parking lot. And that left, we still have 266,500 less revenues than we had last year.
yeah, and I think, I don't want to, Lindsay can be more accurate on this, but I think a lot of that was COVID. We lost a lot of students. We got, I think all of them back, but
Well, that would be,
numbers wise.
but that would be lost students on the 21-22 budget.
Right.
Well, no,
So that would
both,
be this year.
it'd be.
But don't, but.
So this,
You know, they wouldn't have been
Oh,
lost
oh,
on the 2021.
Okay, yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
so this document, besides that budget summary, when the budget comes to you guys as the board, for approval, the budget summary comes with it, and so does this fund balance, document. And so if you look just at the general fund, we'll speak of that first. Now, this is before, this is what went to the board. So you gotta remember that the June 30th, 21 is not gonna be actual, because I printed off what went to the board. Because obviously when we come in the spring, it's before the fiscal year is even over with. But so we were projected to carry over in total in the general fund, $2,666,278. If you look at the proposed revenue column, that ties back to the budget summary of $8,511,449. So that's your current year, only current year revenues. Then the proposed expenditures ties to the $8,587,000. So if you look at the LTFM line right now, you can see we carried over $230,733.
Yeah.
We're only bringing in revenues of $272,000, but we're budgeting to take out $454,000. And the biggest piece of that is the roof project, which we've been talking about. That brings that reserve down to $48,000. So you can see how our expenditures are going to be much higher than our revenues, but we have the reserves there to do the project. So that's why you have to look at both of these together. So then if you look at the unassigned, which is where we need to maintain our fund balance policy and have enough in there to deal with the changes that fluctuate year to year between enrollment fluctuations or less increase to the formula, one-time projects that need to be finished. So you can tell that that is going up. So we're not deficit spending in the unassigned, where that's where we need to make sure that we're maintaining.
Too bad there's not another column here. So you can. Proposed revenues. Because if we didn't spend it the year, was it spent the year before? Because if that's projected, if this is all we had in there before, the 230, and then this was coming in, was there no fund balance in there for 2020? In LTFM?
Off the top of my head, I can't remember, but
Because what happened to that money there and what was that spent on?
LTFM can only be spent on LTFM qualified expenditures.
But you said we get roughly around $250 a year.
It's projected at 272, yeah.
So it'd be interesting to see what it was in 2020 and what we received and then what went out and where it went.
So, let me pull up.
Could you run the same report for the year before?
Yeah, let me just-
Guess I have a tough time understanding how budget balances come into play against expenditures and revenues.
It's not,
That's-
it's confusing, I understand this.
No, I mean, I'm just taking expenditures and revenues. And then over here, we have the fund balances.
Yep.
But I don't see where fund balances come in on this at all.
It doesn't, because that's only your current year revenue and expenditure, that's your budget. But this is your balance sheet, look at it that way, this is the money that you have, let's say, this is your savings account, I mean, that's not
Yeah.
exactly how it works, but this is your fund balance, your reserves is your savings account.
Correct.
Which each year you have revenue come in, each year you have expenditures go out, and then you have your ending reserves. So when the board is approving the budget, they're approving the current year revenue and expenditures. Because that is what, the board on a monthly basis are making sure that they're looking at budget to actual documents. And then when we're looking at approving the budget, they need to make sure that the healthiness of the fund balance is there. So that you're not, yes, it would not make any sense if they approve 5 million in revenue and 10 million in expenditures, and then we're negative over here. So that's why you have to look at these two together, because this is gonna be your current year activity, and this is gonna be how that current activity plays in your reserves that you have sitting there. That makes sense.
But still, the bottom line comes down to your expenditures and revenues, whether it's monthly or whatever, this stuff, whether you have balances, because somewhere then, if your expenditures are more than your revenues, we're overspending somewhere, even if you have fund balance over here, because then something else must not have enough in that fund that the expenditures are more than revenue. You know what I'm saying in that aspect? You can have all the fund balances you want, but when you're looking at the total expenditures and total revenues, if one's more than the other, somewhere you're either getting enough money to come in to keep adding to those fund balances, or you're not getting enough and you're using up somewhere else's fund balance because you're overspending.
Right, but if you have, so you are gonna have some times where your expenditures are bigger than your revenues are, you're never gonna use those restricted reserves. So, for instance, in long-term facility maintenance, the cost of the projects that are out there, the need that is out there is way more than the revenue that we bring in. So you would have to have 1 year where you save the revenue that comes in to carry over to the next year, to have that plus your revenue of the current year to actually do a bigger project. So
What
it's
happens in that 1 year where you don't use your LTFM or you don't use it
but then
for
your
2
revenues are gonna be bigger than your expenditures, so they're gonna bounce back and forth when you have these one-time projects.
Right. Yeah, I see.
So then what report should we be looking at? Because that's why,
I think the point is you have to be looking at all
All
of
of
these.
them.
well, exactly, but it should be able to be on one sheet too.
Oh,
That's what I'm saying. You should be able to see the fund balances with the revenues and expenditures. It should be broken down so you can
Yeah.
see those fund balances
And-
in your, so is that like an income statement then, basically, where the fund balances are? Trying to think out loud, where you can see where your monies are. You can should be able to see all your accounts, like all your checking accounts or whatever. And then, well, I don't know. You know what I'm trying to say? I'm confused myself.
I think I know what you're saying, and I think it is something, Lindsay, you and I talked about a long time ago. It's that they would have to create us a report.
Well, no, like something like what she's referring to, I don't even think is possible to create. So
We put
well,
them at
the general ledger wouldn't be able to create it, like it'd be like a Excel spreadsheet that's updated on a monthly basis. But the problem is you gotta remember, like, your fund balances are gonna be based upon your total year budget. So half of these revenues are either gonna be allocated out at year end. So like, for instance, your levy dollars come in and they come in lump sums. But until you prep for the audit, you're not going to, the allocation to the restricted areas of like LTFM and operating capital and basic skills, all that stuff happens at year end when you're prepping for the audit, where you're breaking it down by all of the reserve accounts. So we can set it up where you're seeing the fund balance and then your current year revenue and your current year expenditures, but that's, you know what I mean, that's only gonna be pieces of it, because you have all these accruals that are gonna be made and allocations to the different restricted areas.
I still think of like a general ledger has all your accounts in there and all the balances in there. And your reserves or whatever before you take them out of there. Somehow there's gotta be a report that we can see these fund balances.
Yeah, I can what I would,
alongside of this or with it, or the breakdown, maybe there's arrows. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
you've gotta be able to see the bigger picture instead of,
Right.
because this is complicated. And
it
I
very-
think
it
as a
very much
board
so is.
member, to be able to do our due diligence to the community and be voting on things,
We
You
need to know.
see the whole
we
thing.
need to
see the whole
really, yeah,
picture.
you have to dumb it down even more, I'm sorry. Because I'm just being totally honest here, I don't wanna vote on stuff that I don't understand, and I wanna know it, like I know it like the back of my hand, like I'm gonna go up, you know what I mean?
Well, the thing is, when we come here and you explain all this, it does make perfect sense. But then later, I'm looking at this, I'm like, what did Lindsay say about this or that?
And the thing is with school finance, you're not gonna know everything.
Well, but you should be able to understand it, or we shouldn't even be on the board, that's my whole problem.
Right.
I'm serious, we're making decisions that are affecting our communities, and so,
And our
I think
children
it's-
and grandchildren.
yeah, I think it's our job as our finance people and our CPAs and whatever, you better explain it to us so we know it, because then, no offense, then you're not doing your job. Not, and I'm not saying it in a mean way, I'm saying it in a loving way. Not very, that's, I'm sorry. No, I meant it in a very kind, not a mean way.
You're not accusing.
No, it's not accusatory. Don't turn right on me, please. No, I just,
I agree.
obviously I'm not alone.
No, I think, I mean, you were a banker, right?
I was in bank boards,
On the bank board, okay.
Oh.
But
that's a lot to grasp.
it's a lot.
And as a board member, you better know what you're doing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's
I'm
your
gonna feel
life.
more confident about that.
I agree. I also think it's important that we recognize Lindsay's expertise here. And we do have to rely to some extent on her saying, we are good, we're okay. I don't need to understand how to do neurosurgery to have neurosurgery done to me and allow it to happen, it's but I should be able to choose the person I'm going to. And
Right.
I don't know where this analogy is going anymore, but it is complicated. So
Right, and I, yeah,
I mean, you could see this report, like this could be part of the board packet, and it would just be like year-to-date numbers against the fund balance, but what I'm saying is that's not the big picture. That's all I mean by that is this right here is the big picture, because this is the budget that you guys approved, and this is showing where we're projected to end the year. So if we're only putting in, year-to-date numbers, it's not actually the fund balance, because it's only taken into consideration the 2 months or the 5 months or whatever it may be that where we're at in the fiscal year. That's all I'm saying is the fund balance is where you're gonna end the fiscal year. Now, if the fiscal year were to stop right there today, that was where it would be. I just want you to understand that this is a balance sheet item. And so even if we put like year-to-date numbers in there versus budget numbers, that's gonna continue to change. Like, that's not the big picture. That's not showing you the financial health of the district.
and which of these?
But you know how you look at the monthly budget report in the board packet where it shows you how that shows you that we're on track is that if you're looking at the percentages, and let's say we're in September and it shows that we've already used 50% of our expenditures, we're in big trouble.
Yeah.
Now that's a little bit of exaggeration, but so that is showing you, like, that is for you guys so that you can to know that we're keeping on track with the budget. And we're following the budget that was approved by you, which shows that we are sitting okay at the end of the year based upon that budget. So what we can do is take something like this that puts those monthly budget numbers in here, but that's not going to show you where we're gonna end the year. I just wanna make sure that we all understand that yes, I can take where we ended last year, add our year-to-date revenues, wherever we're at, October, at our October year-to-date expenditures, and then that's gonna calculate the ending balance for October.
Mhm.
Yep, and then we do it each month.
Yep.
It just, I want you to understand that like this is where it's showing you how effective the budget is versus where our reserves are.
Because on here too, when I'm looking at this unassigned.
Yep.
To me, that's so vague. And unassigned, you can use that money anywhere, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because it's unassigned.
There's much more discretion at how it can be spent.
Exactly.
Correct, but it still can't be spent on everything. I mean, it's school districts obviously still have even in the unassigned, there's still things that are not allowable.
Right, but there's so many categories underneath the unassigned that make up this. Right? There's so many things under, because if we're spending 7 million, we better know what.
Oh
that
yeah,
7 million
that's
is.
everything from salaries and
Right,
benefits
yeah.
down to
Right.
dues and memberships
Mhm.
that are not allowable up here in your restricted categories.
yeah.
Correct.
So if we're gonna be, going over contracts for employees and stuff, that unassigned, we should be looking at that, cause that money's for contracts will be coming out of that amount too.
Well, but it also is up here as well too. Because contracts there's gonna be some that fall under basic skills and learning development, like there's,
Isn't your unassigned anything that isn't dedicated, like set aside for this roof and for resurfacing this surface? And you know, that,
anything that doesn't fall
Under these other
out of
categories.
these other categories. But that means in these other categories, you're still gonna have salaries and benefits, you're still gonna have contracted costs, you're still gonna have supplies, you're still gonna have transportation. So, each category, it can have all of those expenditure activities go through it.
Well, we were talking earlier about using staff development funds to pay for teachers' salaries on staff development day.
Correct.
Because I see now it's, projected to go up, we projected 241,000, the revenues, we have another like 90,000 coming in, 89. Only 50,000 of expenditures, but then we'll have 280,000 in there, so it's actually gone up, or going up.
But
Right,
this is where
so-
we started talking about this.
Correct, so us finding other ways, some other budget efficiencies, like was correct, so this is what came to you guys last April or May. So our conversations, that's why it's evolving all the time, like you're always looking at these numbers. So yes, that's where we projected, but then we talked about as a group that essentially we can take those professional development days and allocate it towards that. So right now, they weren't in the proposed expenditures, but that's a thought that we've had since when this came to you guys as a board.
I think you and I started talking maybe August about that,
Mm-hmm.
because we have 3 days at the beginning of the school year before students are here. It's almost all staff development. And maybe not the entire days could be coded to that, because some of it isn't staff development, but a lot of that can be. And I'm guessing that this number, the 50,885, that is probably going to conferences
Correct.
and nothing much more than that. So
Conferences and having like Southwest Service Cooperative come in and do, we've done some
Trainings,
professional
yeah,
trainings,
yeah.
we've done professional development with them as well.
Yeah.
Yep, so that's not including that allocation that we would like to do.
So if we wanted to even expand the training, we have plenty of money to expand that training for teachers, to add some really cool stuff.
yeah, we've always been pretty good about if a teacher wants to do and not just teachers, custodians, food service, if somebody wants to do further training on something, we want to make it happen. So at least in the 6 years I've been here, we've been pretty good about getting people extra training.
Okay, I have a couple of quick questions here too, for non-suspendable, other committed, and other assigned.
Yep.
Could you explain those a little bit?
So non-spendable is GASB, it's GASB 54, we're required to set those funds aside And they are made up of if you have inventory, if you have prepaids, if you have certain receivables. So that is an accounting entry that has to be done at the end of each year. And it comes from the unassigned and it adjusts that non-spendable based upon some of your balances in those categories.
Okay.
So it's a requirement that we have to do.
And it
Yep.
comes from the unassigned, okay.
Correct.
And then other committed, Fund 1.
So other committed, we've looked at these before, and these are board designated reserves.
Yes. Okay,
And
that's
only the board has control over these committed funds. So they would have to commit them and they would have to release them.
okay. And that's the one I asked about before, why we haven't been using that for repairs. We could use a chunk of that to go.
We would just have to,
Approve it as a board.
recommit them to that specific project, because right now, like I said, those projects are so vague, and they're, you know what I mean, they're not designated for specific things, that's what would have to happen, and then it can be used, correct?
Project.
So why couldn't we use that to pay back the community
Yeah.
service?
That too.
If the board does an action to do that, they can do that.
Well,
It's only at the board level.
we can kill two birds with one stone.
Careful with PETA if you're.
But like,
I like
a
it.
few years ago, we were looking, like, if you look at the 542,000 that's sitting in an assigned, I know for one person, like that sounds like a lot of money, but when you're looking at $8.6 million expenditure budget, that's not a lot of money. So at one point, it was looking like we had to take those other committed and other signs and say, we're releasing them and they have to go to the unassigned fund balance or we're gonna be in big trouble. That's why it's a very, you have to constantly be looking at it to make sure that you're not getting yourselves into trouble with those reserves, because if you don't have those reserves there and something tragic happens or something major happens, you don't have anything sitting there. And it's not like a school district can go to the local bank and take out a loan. There's a whole process for that, so.
Tax anticipation certificates.
Yep, but that's a whole process and it
All
doesn't
right.
happen quickly either.
Been there, done that.
Yep. So, we're finally making progress to increasing that to where we need to be with our fund balance policy and then what's a comfortable level financially.
Well, that's our cash flow.
Correct, so that's why you have to be careful too when you're looking at this, oh, there's money sitting there, let's spend it down, well then, if
We
you.
only get our revenues so many times during the year.
Correct.
Right. I get that too. And then in the same token, at some point you have to stop the bleeding or cut the fat somewhere, so you're not always overspending
Right.
what your revenue is too.
Right, well, and that's what we were working on, but I feel like, what I'm just saying is we're not quite there where we're at a comfortable level, so you have to be careful what you're doing with those reserves as well.
So that other committed fund then, that the board has set aside for some
Projects.
mystical project, do we know what that is?
We've looked at the line items, but I've researched it, I've had Joy research it. I wish there was in the board minutes because this was prior to a lot of us, I think. I wish there was descriptions or specifically, there had to be something that derived this. There had to be projects in mind, but there's not detailed descriptions on what those specific projects necessarily are. And since they're committed funds, we need to make sure that we're spending those funds on what exactly they were committed for. So I think it would just be better to relook at that and either decide you're going to recommit them for a specific purpose or you release them. I mean, as a board, I just think it needs to be looked at to make sure that we're very clear on what those funds should be for. I'm not gonna quote expenditures there when I don't specifically know that was the intent of that committed
So
dollar amount.
if a previous board, let's say 10 years ago, said we're gonna set $500,000 aside to do project A. We're obviously not still committed to having to do
No,
project A.
the board can release that anytime they want,
Yeah,
correct?
so it's still under our discretion regardless of what the previous boards have done.
Correct.
Right.
It just has to be done. It's just an action that has to be taken.
And I know, like you say, we don't wanna just spend it because we've got it, but
Because
No,
that is our
Right,
cash
but
flow.
also
Yeah.
possibly paying back some of community service,
Right.
still have it. We're not spending it, you're,
No, you're just putting it where
Putting it in.
it's supposed to be. You're just.
Yeah, right,
Cause it's
Why
either
wouldn't we
sitting
wanna
here or it's
do
over
that?
there.
right.
right.
Do what?
repay community service with that. Because
Would be
the,
responsible.
it looks terrible.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
I don't disagree. But I also think financially doing it at a little bit slower pace is also better to make sure that, like I said, if we were making our fund balance policy and there was a little bit more cushion in there, then I wouldn't have that concern. And then I would be like, yeah, that makes complete sense. But to move $500,000 out of
Sure.
the general, and you can't bring it back. It doesn't work that way. You can't go
Right.
back and
Right.
forth.
No.
what if you took a chunk, but then still did, your payback?
Correct, that's what I'm
Maybe it
saying.
could be
I would
both.
I would just prefer that we do it at a smaller pace until
Sure.
financially we are right where we want to be.
What
And
if,
where is that? Where would that be?
I mean, yeah, where would you
Perfect.
be comfortable with the general
Yeah.
fund?
Yeah, no, but what is where we wanna be?
Right, yeah.
well, first let me ask, like, could you see doing something like, our goal is gonna be $100,000 a year to transfer that back to community service. And if we're able to make up $20,000 from tuition to pay that off, well, then we would take $80,000 from the other committed fund one to pay off the rest of that $100,000. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just coming to the understanding of what makes sense. What's the lump sum in 1 year and then what's the payment plan going forward?
So we need to have some way of, a better way, I should say, of keeping track of a history of why we're doing things. Because boards turn over time, and then you got O'Neill sitting back there going, what are you guys doing? We had this all planned out, and then it goes away after people turn over, and
That's why you document it in your minutes.
and you have it in the minutes, but the problem with the minutes is they're in, I mean, we've got, 30 books full of minutes back there.
That's why you keep transparency and keeping everything clean is huge. So
I-
people can
And
follow that.
I agree, but I think we need more than just, when we reserve funds for something like that, everyone should know.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly, without a doubt.
It needs to be more than just tucked in one of those books in there.
Yeah.
Right, so like it was an action item that was done, which is fine. But that's where what I would have expected to see a document in the permanent, board minutes as far as exactly what it was laid out from.
That would be so easy for us to do going forward, is just having that we've committed this money from this fund. That's why it's in there.
Yep.
And then if it doesn't get spent or it's not needed, then there's no question of what the plan was.
And I'm sure at the point when that was done, it made complete sense. And
Oh, I'm sure.
everybody knew exactly what it was. It's
Nobody
just-
puts away $765,000 just on a whim.
Yeah. And that's why you need to stop the bleeding then, because then you have an end point to where you're done paying this off and it's flowing itself. It's paying for
Yep,
itself.
That's
So
exactly what needs to happen.
Yeah.
But that's also, the repayment's also built on the fact that the budget will balance.
Correct.
That's right.
Right.
Yep.
And so we see an end to it.
Exactly.
But like for a lump sum, I guess I'd like to see what the dollar is, the difference between the 44% and 7%. And then build up over 5 years, see what is that lump sum, you know?
Mhm.
Have that number to look at as a down payment and then balance the budget. And then, like I said, we're gonna have to let a little more aggressive payment than half of the minimum credit card payment.
Right, I just
Yeah.
wanted to show you
That was
guys
a good
what
option.
it was gonna take.
Yeah. Right.
Yep.
So
Yep.
because you can't pay off 33 and charge 58,000. So.
Yep.
It doesn't work. I think we've had a really good discussion on
Yeah.
things. I think we've all learned a lot tonight.
And you
Lindsay, I want to thank you for trying to pound it through our skulls.
Yeah, anytime.
Okay, I still have another question I want to bring up quick, so, it's about the SR3 funds. And Lindsay and I were talking briefly before the meeting started about, it's like 1,097,000, whatever, but there's two categories, right?
Correct.
160 and 161, could you explain that, and then what we can do with those funds?
Yep, so the 161 is made up of 20% of the allocation. That is very restrictive in nature. It needs to be done for after-school programming or summer school programming only. So we have the after-school programming started now. And these funds are good through September 30th of 2024. So we have multi-years to run these programs. There could be other things done during the summer. And then the 160 is the 80%. And that's less restrictive in nature, but it's still on the emphasis of learning loss and how we get back to that. And being careful that we're making sure financially that these are one-time expenditures so that when these one-time dollar goes away, we're not sitting in a hole because the revenue is no longer there, but the programming or the payroll is there.
Right.
Yep.
So not necessarily for salaries to go up,
Right.
or it's like,
Right, and we are doing some of that, correct, but
so do we have, is that spoken for, any of those funds right now, the SR3 funds? Do we have a plan for those right now?
Yeah.
We do.
yep, we've, and we're using it. For example, we've had a lot of mental health needs in the district, and we haven't been able to keep up with serving those needs. So we've taken a little bit of that to hire another social worker. I'm not sure if she's a social worker or a counselor, but she's a social worker, I believe, who's now able to come in and start spending more time working with kids who are struggling. And it's a huge need. And so that's a great way to spend those dollars. But it is a salary, so at some point in time that either
Well, this
goes
is
away.
contracted work.
Yeah, it's contracted work. Yeah, but it's also a program that hopefully, ideally, we don't need anymore at some point in time.
And what is that annually, the contracted?
I don't remember. It's a daily
It's a daily rate.
$240.
Oh, I had that all figured out last week.
These SR3 funds for after school net, is that available to other kids in the community in non-traditional education? Or non-public schools?
I mean, like homeschool.
Homeschool
So-
or the parochial school, the Christian schools?
Well, yeah, if we started a program, we would certainly allow them to come and join it, but no, it doesn't. We
There's
don't.
no funding that flows.
If I'm homeschooling my kid, I can't say, hey, you owe me $1,000.
So the non-publics do have their own flow through of these federal dollars that we're speaking of.
Okay, so that's outside of this allocation or?
Correct. So the first allocation that came out is just like our other federal dollars, like our title program, where you have to calculate the equitable share. And then we work with them and their expenses run through here for their entitlement amount. But then after MDE went reevaluated and all that stuff with the other allocations, they have their own way of getting their funds. And so instead of flowing through the district to the non-publics, it's now flowing to the
It
non-publics.
flows directly to them.
Correct. Yep. For these federal dollars, like
Yeah.
we still run the title program and all that stuff the same.
So that 20% would be roughly 200,000 for the restricted.
Yep.
So then 800,000 would be for the less restricted.
Correct. And so like how these allocations work is, you have to go through the application process so that you can have the funds. And then, so you have the entitlement, but the entitlement doesn't get spent down until the actual expenditures occur.
Okay.
Yep. So it's not like an advance payment or anything. And that's why it wasn't included in the adopted 22 budget, because when those funds came out and they were talking about how it's gonna be a big planning process and you had to figure out how you were gonna have recovery, your learning plan. So at that time, when we discussed it internally, it didn't make sense to just put the revenue in there when we had no idea what our plan was going to be. So, just so you know that it's not like it's sitting as revenue in the budget and there's not expenditures either. Like we just decided it would be best if programs were gonna start in 22, that when we're revising the budget, then we would explain, okay, so now we allocated so much of the Sr3 funds, it's in revenue, and then we have the expenditures as well, offsetting them.
What's the turnaround time to get that money in? Because you said you have to have the expenditures first, so you have to spend it first.
You have to spend it first.
So that gets tricky too for school districts that are running pretty lean.
If you're running lean, yep, you're gonna be doing draws all the time if you're running that lean, because you're right, most of these expenditures obviously are above budgeted. So, yep, but usually when you draw, it's a few day turnaround.
Okay, so it's pretty quick.
Another thing I'll mention is we're always asking for input on what people want to see or what needs people feel they see in the district. Mr. Benson has been sending out surveys. Early on, we sent out a phone call, and part of that was just saying, hey, let us know what you'd like to see. So we started this after school homework help, where we pay a teacher, we pay a para to be in there to help kids that struggle getting homework done. And that's been going really well. Margaret gets them a snack, and then we bust the kids back that need. So that's been great. The only negative is you get a kid who shows up to get one assignment done, and then they gotta wait for a bus at 5 o'clock. So that's tough. And we're not gonna schedule a bus that just keeps going around and around and around. But it's a start, and it's great that we're able to do that.
We could do wraparound enrichment stuff too, but
Yeah.
it takes a lot of planning, obviously. So like that's something to always take into consideration too, is that, and you and Brett have already talked about this, is there would be the homework help piece of it, and then there would be fun enrichment activities to get kiddos in the door, where it could be in one room, it could be this, in one room, it could be that. That's the type of stuff that those funds are used for, I guess, an example.
One thing Lindsay and I have been talking about, and I've learned you shouldn't speculate ideas in public like this, but I'm gonna do it anyway. We've been talking about upping our CTE program, and our metal shop is way behind the times, and maybe looking at a CNC plasma cutter, and then kids could create projects, cut them out, weld them together, and we could do that both after school, and that could help our regular curriculum too.
And those are really nice long-term things that you can use instead of just using for a short time, using up the, the program itself and let it run until it runs out, then it's done. These are tangible
Right,
things that
right,
you can have.
right. The only ongoing costs are materials.
And that's why it's good to match the 160 funds with your with generating replacement schedules. Because what you're doing is you're getting those items that are gonna help you in your budgets in the future. Because you're replacing, maybe, let's say we haven't looked at science curriculum in 10 years. I don't really know if that's true, just as an example. So then you would get a science curriculum, which is gonna help. But it's one-time funds being used for one-time purchases.
But so any of the 2 people watching here today, and whoever sees it in the future, let people know, we're looking, if you have ways that you think might be beneficial, send us your ideas, even, I'm a big believer in bad ideas can turn into good ideas. So it might not be exactly what you're thinking, but we want the input.
Any other questions?
All right,
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Lindsay.
yeah, thank you very much.
You guys
This
are
would have been a
welcome.
quick meeting if I was trying to explain it. I'll see if I can find a way to post these onto the recorded minutes here, or video here. All right, well, we'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you.